we're especially pleased to commemorate the 60th anniversary of the UN Commission on Human Rights. And it's a special honor to have Deputy High Commissioner Kang join us tonight. Tonight's presentation is the fourth in a series on human rights. We've heard about gender and human rights, indigenous rights, and healthcare as a human right. And tonight we'll hear about the critical role that the UN plays in defining and defending human rights. Tonight's presentation must be understood in the context of a century that has witnessed the most horrible transgressions imaginable against human rights. It's the memory of these transgressions that helps us understand we not only have to restrain our own impulses towards evil and violent, but to protect others from those impulses both now and in the future. In this context, international organizations like the UN, Amnesty International, and many others are our partners, and we're deeply appreciative of their efforts and look to work with them. I want to thank Rebecca, the Drescher Center, and the Social Sciences Forum for sponsoring tonight's lecture. It's through your efforts that we recognize UMBC as a community of scholars that is committed to studying not only what is, but what can and should be. It's now my pleasure to turn the program over to Rebecca, who will introduce Deputy High Commissioner Kang.
Good evening, my name is Rebecca Boehling, and I'm the director of the Drescher Center for the Humanities here at UMBC. 2 years ago, when I was asked to serve as the director of a new humanities research center, I quickly began thinking about how the center might lead the way in drawing attention to ethical and human rights concerns. I recall fantasizing with Michelle OHCHR, the center's associate director, about having a series commemorating the then upcoming 60th anniversary of the UN Declaration of Human Rights. I said half jokingly, we could even ask someone to speak from the United Nations. Well, I was enough of an optimist to go ahead and try it. A year ago, I wrote the UN's High Commission for Human Rights, and they wrote back on UN letterhead, no less. When they indicated that the Deputy High Commissioner, Dr. Kang, was willing to come to UMBC and be part of this human rights lecture series, I was dumbfounded. But here we are today. And I am so grateful for the Deputy High Commissioner's willingness to fly all the way from Geneva just to speak with us about the UN's role in defining and defending human rights. This is her first time in Baltimore, and apparently, back at the UN offices in Geneva, her colleagues were also surprised she was coming to Baltimore. Our UMBC Humanities and Social Sciences Forum last fall began this human rights lecture series with a focus on gender and human rights in Zimbabwe and South Africa, one on healthcare as a human right, a third lecture on indigenous rights in Latin America, and one by UMBC's own political science professor, Jeffrey Davis, on the struggle for human rights in US courts. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted by the UN General Assembly on the 10th of December, 1948, just 3 years after the end of World War II and all of its atrocities. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights proclaimed that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, regardless of race, color, sex, language, religion, or politics, national or social origin, property or birth. It states that, quote, everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of person, end quote. The UN Declaration also stresses the right to socioeconomic security and social and cultural rights, which are considered indispensable to dignity. It stresses the right to work and protection from unemployment, the right to equal pay for equal work and remuneration worthy of human dignity, the right to leisure and holidays, to an adequate standard of living, to food, clothing, housing, and medical care, to a social net when misfortune or old age strike, a right to basic free education and affordable higher education, a right to enjoy the arts and participate in the cultural life of the community. These are wonderful ideals, but unfortunately, they remain far too often as ideals on paper, rather than realities in nations across the world. Tonight, the Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights will speak to us about the role of the UN in defining and defending human rights. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Kang, who was appointed Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights in September 2006 and took up the position on the 15th of January 2007. Her appointment is at the level of Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations. Before joining the United Nations, Dr. Kang, a national of the Republic of Korea, was Director General of International Organizations at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade of the Republic of Korea, with duties covering a wide range of UN issues, including human rights. She also served as Minister at the Republic of Korea Mission to the United Nations in New York. She chaired the Commission on the Status of Women for its 48th session in 2004 and its 49th session in 2005, an important anniversary. Prior to joining the Foreign Service in 1998, Dr. Kang worked for the National Parliament of the Republic of Korea. She also served as the spokesperson of the Korean Women's NGO Committee at the 1995 Beijing Conference. Earlier in her career, she worked for the Korean Broadcasting System and lectured in universities both in Korea and in the United States. She graduated from Yonsei University, where she completed a BA in Political Science and Diplomacy. I think it's a wonderful combination. She then obtained an MA in Mass Communication and a PhD defending a doctoral thesis on intercultural communication from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. UMBC has a graduate program in intercultural communication. I suspect a number of our faculty are present, as well as former and present students from that program. Dr. Kang will speak for approximately 30 minutes and then take questions. We have microphones in the aisles, you see on either side, and then one up here in the front, for people to line up to ask questions. So in the meantime, please join me in welcoming the UN Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights, Dr. Kang.
Thank you very much, Professor Boehling, for that very warm and generous introduction. As Professor Boehling has indicated, this is not my usual realm of activities. I am in Geneva. If I'm not in Geneva, I am in New York, where the UN headquarters is, or I am in the field, where our office has human rights activities undertaken by our officers. So, but to go out of that usual realm of activity and to come to a very different audience and partners for not only a speech, but hopefully an interactive dialogue later on is an unusual experience for me, but it's a wonderful experience for me to be able to come and to a youthful audience with minds that are endlessly hopeful, with dreams and plans for the future. So to have this opportunity to do my bit to enrich that and perhaps to even influence that is a privilege. So I'm very grateful for this opportunity. My job this evening is to provide you with a lecture that rounds out the 60th UDHR celebration, which was last year. And sorry for coming a little bit on the late side as you round up those discussions, but better late than never. So very happy to be here. But the human rights calendar has been truly intense during this past year. Not only did we celebrate the twin 60th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and of the International Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, which was adopted one day before the Universal Declaration. Just 2 weeks ago, we also successfully concluded the Durban Review Conference in Geneva, against racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. And despite the controversy that had surrounded this conference, the vast majority of UN member states adopted by consensus a final document that, if fully given effect and implemented, will help to alleviate the situation of millions of victims of racism all over the world. So therefore, I welcome this opportunity that you offer me to take stock of these developments of the past year. And I will do so by putting things in a historical as well as contemporary context of the work of the human rights mechanisms of the United Nations to implement the ever-expanding human rights agenda. And I will conclude by discussing or offering some of my thoughts on the role that the new US administration could play in fostering this international human rights agenda. First, let me talk about the UN human rights normative framework. 6 decades ago, by proclaiming the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the international community affirmed that the force of shared ideas and of common vision of respectful and peaceful coexistence based on the inherent dignity and equality of every member of humanity can prevail over brutality, hatred, and destruction. The Universal Declaration enshrined the hope for a better world where aspirations to freedom and well-being converge. This was a direct echo of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's vision of 4 interlocking freedoms: freedom from want, freedom from fear, freedom of expression, and freedom of worship. His vision challenged the international community that was emerging from the horrors of World War II and the Holocaust to promote liberty through democracy, justice, and an equitable distribution of resources, and to create an environment tolerant of dissent and difference, enhancing opportunities for all to live a life with dignity. The framers of the Universal Declaration succeeded in delivering the first articulation of those rights and freedoms. They envisaged a world in which every man, woman, and child lives free from hunger and protected from oppression, violence, and discrimination, with the benefits of housing, healthcare, education, and opportunity. They thus planted the seeds for the emergence of a global culture of human rights. And 6 decades later today, a complex web of international human rights instruments have fleshed out the content of the baskets of rights that the Universal Declaration spelled out, including civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights. And all states have ratified at least one of the core international human rights treaties, and most, 80% of countries, have ratified over 4 or more of these instruments. However, this evolution of the past decades has not been without challenges. In the aftermath of World War II, the geopolitical bipolarity of the Cold War undermined the unified approach to rights as envisioned in the declarations. States with command economies and developing countries argued that the need for survival, i.e. economic, social, and cultural rights, took priority over the luxury, as they called it, of civil and political rights. On the other side, Western governments feared that this approach would either hamper free market practices or impose overly cumbersome financial obligations on states. Thus, they chose to advocate the civil and political rights that were more akin to their political traditions and which were regarded as the pillars of democracy. As a result, the basket of economic and social and cultural rights languished on the back burner. And that is until a drastic reshuffling of the global dynamics could start to take shape, and as it did with the crumbling of the Berlin Wall and the demise of the Cold War. Not surprisingly, these divergences between the proponents of civil and political rights and those of economic and social rights gave and continues to give both solace and excuse to those who called into question the very universality of human rights. Some of these skeptics are in good faith, others are not. The problem is that human rights stand at the core of the relationship between a government and its people. And governments, especially those that lack democratic legitimacy, are loath to be told how they should or shouldn't treat their own people. Even some of the staunchest proponents of human rights become very defensive and self-righteous even when the critical focus is placed on them. Against this background, it is not difficult to understand why critics of universality were always more readily available than genuine introspection on how to address the underlying causes that prevent uniform application of universal human rights. But the profound, self-evident ideal of universality of rights proclaimed in the Declaration could not be held back indefinitely. Freed from the ideological and political shackles of the Cold War era, the world came to embrace the proponents of universality in making the case for a fuller, more faithful realization of the ideals of the Declaration. Thus, at the Vienna World Conference on Human Rights in 1993, the international community reaffirmed the universality of human rights, the interdependence, interconnectedness, and indivisibility of all rights, the organic whole that is made up of civil, cultural, economic, social, and political rights that must be nurtured holistically and persistently, so as to realize the Declaration's vision of all rights for all. So today, with increased sharpness, advocates highlight the need to pursue all rights simultaneously. To this end, we underscore the primary duty of states to give effect to the full spectrum of rights, as well as the responsibility of the international community and its institutions, such as the United Nations, to foster a culture of vigilance in implementation and solidarity, in bolstering capacities at the national level to serve the purposes of freedom, along with social justice. The process of adopting the Declaration's norms, giving them effect in law and implementing them, is still ongoing at the international and national levels, with regional entities increasingly weighing in as well. The 6 decades of UN norm and standard setting and advocacy on human rights are also reflected in a rising rights consciousness on the part of governments as duty bearers and of citizens as rights holders around the world. In recent decades, this has also coincided with the growth of democracies and the affirmation of democratic principles in many parts of the world. Simply put, compared with previous generations, people today are far more aware of and ready to claim their rights as human beings, though perhaps not necessarily in the technical legalistic terms as spelled out in the international norms and their interpretations. They are conscious of their equal worth and dignity as human beings and their entitlements vis-a-vis those who govern them. At the same time, the sense of injustice and anger when rights are denied has also grown. Whether expressed in the form of advocacy, or by the ballot, or through protest, the fight for justice and equality has become a powerful drive for social change. Now on the UN Human Rights institutional framework, let me first talk about our office, the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. There is often much confusion between the office, which is part of the UN Secretariat, charged with taking the lead on UN's work on human rights, and the institution that I represent, and the Human Rights Council, which is an intergovernmental body that in June 2006 replaced the former Commission on Human Rights, the institution which drafted the Universal Declaration under the leadership of Eleanor Roosevelt. Our office, OHCHR, as its very strange acronym has put it, OHCHR, our office, was created in 1993 as an offshoot of the World Conference on Human Rights, which took place in Vienna. It was the Vienna process that gave concrete voice to the long-standing wish of the human rights community to create a post of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. But the conference itself could not flesh out what the task of the post would be, and deferred the matter for discussion at the General Assembly here in New York. Thus, the work fell upon the General Assembly in late 1993 to negotiate what a UN Human Rights High Commissioner should be and do. The result, Resolution 48/141, that was adopted after intense negotiations, offered much flexibility for future adaptation in response to evolving needs and conditions. This also meant that the personal vision and leadership of the incumbents would largely determine the orientation and evolution of the office and the UN Human Rights Program. Thus, each High Commissioner has made his or her mark as the office evolved over the past 15 years. The first High Commissioner, Jose Ayala Lasso, built the foundation of the new office. His successor, Mary Robinson, further institutionalized these avenues for action and strengthened the High Commissioner's advocacy role on behalf of the victims of human rights violations. Her insistence that civil and political rights and economic and social and cultural rights constitute an indivisible whole continues to resonate to this day. The third High Commissioner, Sergio Vieira de Mello, was instrumental in moving forward the process of engaging the larger UN system on human rights issues, although his period, as some of you may know, in office was tragically too short, as he died in the infamous Baghdad bombing in the August of 2003. Acting High Commissioner Bertie Ramcharan, while holding the fort pending the arrival of the next High Commissioner, pushed ahead on pressing human rights issues, especially in the Security Council. Subsequently, Louise Arbour of Canada, a former Supreme Justice of Canada, led the office through a time of unprecedented expansion and reform with exceptional drive and strategic thinking. The current High Commissioner, Navi Pillay, took office in September last year and has successfully steered the office through the very challenging Durban Review Conference Against Racism. And as I will explain later, that conference stirred contrasting sentiments and passions both in the United States and elsewhere. But ultimately, the conference produced a document that serves the purpose of implementing the anti-racism agenda worldwide. I will expand on the challenges facing the new High Commissioner in further detail later on, but let me draw your attention back to, in a few years back in history, to the year 2005. Because this year was very pivotal for the office and the UN Human Rights Program. In response to the call by the then Secretary General Kofi Annan in his report on UN reform, entitled In Larger Freedom, High Commissioner Louise Arbour at the time presented a very ambitious plan of action for the office, outlining a strategic vision for the OHCHR. The document was presented to the World Summit in the fall of 2005. The summit acknowledged the evolution of the UN Human Rights Program and gave human rights a new standing as one of the 3 pillars of the United Nations, next to peace and security and development. The summit called for the creation of the Human Rights Council to replace the Commission on Human Rights, and last but not least, made the commitment to significantly strengthen the office of the High Commissioner by doubling its regular budget's funding. The evolution of the UN Human Rights Program that led to the 2005 summit decisions continued to materialize through the work of our office, and that can be described as a shift from standard setting to standard implementation, from headquarters to the field, from disconnected endeavors to an integrated approach. Therefore, greater engagement with partners on the ground, in the field, enhanced leadership role of the High Commissioner through strengthened advocacy for victims of violations and vulnerable groups, closer partnerships with UN entities and civil societies, and greater synergy with the Human Rights Council, the treaty bodies, and the special procedures are the key tenets that guide the work of the office in implementing the High Commissioner's very broad mandate. For the office, taking human rights to the field means working intensively at the country level with national governments, national human rights institutions, civil society, and a wide range of local stakeholders to make certain that international human rights standards and the recommendations of treaty bodies and special procedures are reflected in national law and properly respected by national and local institutions. It also means coordinating efforts to mainstream human rights throughout the peace, development, and humanitarian assistance activities of the United Nations. And indeed, this is one area where further investment of OHCHR expertise and resources will be increasingly called for in the years to come. Continuing efforts are also needed to strengthen the policy and operational guidance from a human rights perspective, to build capacities throughout the UN system, and to ensure that programmatic incentives are aligned with human rights imperatives. The new High Commissioner Navi Pillay took office at a time when OHCHR's functional and institutional maturity is in its ripe stage. The coming years are expected to be a period of consolidation for the office itself. Meanwhile, old challenges persist and new challenges to securing freedom from fear and freedom from want for all continue to rise. Discrimination, poverty, conflict, women's and migrants' rights, torture, rape, summary and arbitrary executions, disappearances, arbitrary detentions, and other serious human rights violations continue to occur and often go unpunished. In the midst of climate change, the food crisis, the economic downturn, as well as other global issues that tend to be framed in macro material terms, keeping the focus on human consequences in the language of human rights continues to be an uphill struggle. Moving now to the Human Rights Council. And as I already mentioned, this body was created with a decision of the 2005 World Summit so as to replace the much criticized and discredited Commission on Human Rights, which in time had lost some of its initial luster and often had become the theater of confrontation where narrow parochial interest held sway. With the Council, the world leaders wish to stimulate new impetus for human rights and create a genuine new beginning. However, here in the United States and elsewhere, skeptics were unwilling to give the nascent council the benefit of the doubt or to be counted among its members. They argued and continue to argue that the Human Rights Council, as the intergovernmental body tasked to promote universal respect for the protection of all human rights and fundamental freedoms for all, is merely representing a distinction without any difference from its discredited predecessor, the Commission. They reason that human rights abusers can still use this forum, as they did in the Commission, for partisan grandstanding and to shelter themselves from criticism regarding their own less than pristine records in human rights. They point out that the Council is as politicized as the Commission, with regional and political groups swaying the discussions frequently along concerns that have little to do with human rights. These are all valid points, but they only see the negative side without due mention of the positive aspects, of which there is, in fact, quite a lot to be said about the Council. First of all, almost 3 years since starting its operation, it is undeniable that the Council's assessment at regular intervals of the human rights record of all UN member states, all 192 UN member states, and known as the Universal Periodic Review, is a genuinely innovative and constructive conception. Only further time can tell whether the review will effectively change for the better the human rights situation on the ground. But for the present, we should recognize that this initiative carries a very promising potential. In its first year, last year, the first 48 countries came under review, and they took this endeavor very seriously. This year, another batch of 48 countries is being reviewed, and by the end of the 4-year cycle, all 192 members will have been peer reviewed. Secondly, unlike the Commission, the Council is virtually a standing body. The frequency of its meetings, both in formal and informal settings, creates more opportunities to better hone operations and responses to both chronic human rights conditions and crises. Among the latter, the Council tackled the recent food emergencies and the economic downturn with a sense of urgency that they deserved. This assiduity of the Council's meetings may also help to build a firmer ground of understanding among the Council members that sporadic interactions would allow for. Furthermore, the criticism that the Council is politicized is misplaced. Intergovernmental discussions, where government delegations representing national interest defend their positions and vie for influence, are inherently political, and the Human Rights Council cannot be an exception. To expect otherwise is to misunderstand the nature of multilateralism. Although our office, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and the Human Rights Council operate collaboratively but independently, the ongoing discussion about the relationship between the office and the Human Rights Council has not always been unproblematic. Indeed, thinking through the relationship between the Council and the office will be one challenge that the new High Commissioner is examining in consultation with member states and other stakeholders, particularly in light of the review of the Council that the General Assembly will be undertaking in the year 2011. However, as the discussions unfold, the outcome must be one of reaffirmation of the independence and impartiality of the High Commissioner and her office, firmly grounded upon international human rights standards. This outcome is critical to the office's ability to undertake the broad mandate of promoting and protecting the human rights of all. Now, the term of this new High Commissioner. Upon taking office, High Commissioner Navi Pillay stressed the need to take advantage of the 60th anniversary of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide to give new impulse to the prevention component of this fundamental human rights treaty. As the former president of the International Tribunal on Rwanda and a judge with the International Criminal Court, Navi Pillay knows all too well the cost of turning a blind eye to the first symptoms of impending mass atrocities. She acknowledges that while international criminal justice has made great strides in punishing genocide, measures to avert this most heinous of crimes have failed to keep apace. The High Commissioner grew up as a non-white South African during the apartheid regime. She has, therefore, firsthand and painfully personal knowledge that it is not so much identity differences, but structures and policies of marginalization, exclusion, and discrimination, as well as a denial of human rights, including economic, social, and cultural rights, that are at the core of and as the root cause of genocide and other large-scale human rights abuses. Achieving an environment of respect for equality and non-discrimination is essential to avert disasters of such magnitude that scar the conscience of humanity. Therefore, the Durban Review Conference that took place in Geneva just 2 weeks ago was called precisely to take measure of progress made by governments in confronting some of the most egregious and historically deep-rooted aspects of discrimination and inequality, namely racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. 8 years had lapsed since the conclusion of the first World Conference on these topics, which was held in Durban in 2001. Therefore, an assessment of deeds done and future practical measures to better implement the outcome of the Durban Conference, known as the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, the final document that Durban produced, was of capital importance now and here. Racism is a denial of human rights, pure and simple. It may be institutionalized, as the Holocaust was, or it may express less formally as the hatred of a particular people or class, as anti-Semitism, for example, or the more recent Islamophobia. We see such intolerance in national histories that deny the identity of others, or that reject rightful grievances of minorities who might not share a so-called official history. We see it emerging in new forms, such as human trafficking, whose victims tend to be mostly women and children of low socioeconomic status. Refugees, asylum seekers, migrant workers, and undocumented immigrants are increasingly being stigmatized, if not persecuted. A new politics of xenophobia is on the rise. Discrimination does not go away by itself. It must be challenged at every turn, as Secretary General Ban Ki-moon stated in his opening address at the Durban Review Conference. These observations may seem obvious, yet the Review Conference was marred by the same controversy that had cast a long shadow over the consensual results of the 2001 Durban gathering. At that time, some non-governmental organizations at the fringes of the conference had made repugnant anti-Semitic attacks. And although rejected by the conference itself, such attacks prompted the United States and Israel to walk out. Since then, fearing a repetition of those circumstances, a vociferous lobby of anti-Durban groups tried to discredit the review conference process even before it actually unfolded. This was particularly regrettable and misleading because if people took time to actually read the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, they would realize that the document is really a very comprehensive and constructive guide to national governments and other actors in taking on the challenge of racism around the world. Very specifically, contrary to the misperception perpetuated out there that it denies the Holocaust and singles out Israel for criticism, it includes a paragraph which specifically says that the Holocaust should never be forgotten. It includes 2 paragraphs that denounce anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, and 1 paragraph which mentions the suffering of the Palestinians and their right of self-determination, as well as the security of all states in the region, including Israel, and 2 paragraphs calling for peace. And that is all there is on the Middle East, and very frankly, this language is hardly disputable. But despite the controversy and the absence of 10 Western countries, including the United States, the review conference reached consensus on an excellent outcome document. This document is carefully balanced. It addresses key issues. It takes concrete steps toward ending the politics of hatred and setting the stage for action in a global campaign for justice for victims of racism worldwide. In framing this plan for action, member states showed flexibility and unity of purpose and an unprecedented spirit of compromise and respect for diversity as our times demand. The document urges states to prevent manifestations of racism, racial discrimination, and xenophobia, especially in relation to migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. States are also asked to promote greater participation and opportunities for people of African and Asian descent, indigenous peoples, and individuals belonging to national or ethnic, religious, or linguistic minorities. And very importantly, the document reaffirms the centrality of freedom of expression and stresses its compatibility with existing international law that prohibits incitement to hatred. Ladies and gentlemen, young and not so young. At an event during the Durban Review Conference, Stefan Hessel, a Holocaust survivor and a drafter of the Universal Declaration, spoke very movingly about the election of US President Obama. He pointed out how his victory incarnated the spirit and the aims of the conference. Yet, as I mentioned before, the United States decided not to participate in this important gathering. The High Commissioner has now urged all states which stayed away to evaluate the outcome document on its own merit and substance. We are encouraging them to rejoin in the international efforts to combat racism as mapped out by the outcome document at the earliest opportunity. Indeed, President Barack Obama took office amid great expectations that human rights will be at the center of his administration's agenda. Many in his administration are well-known human rights advocates and humanitarian-minded individuals. He should not disappoint the hopes of those who see in his presidency an opportunity to restore international trust in US leadership and support for human rights. Crucial to achieving these goals is a mutually respectful partnership between the United States and the United Nations. However, there is no hiding the fact that recently the United Nations has come under some harsh criticism, in particular in the United States. Therefore, the question for the new presidency is how to overcome diffidence, restore trust, and maximize US participation in an environment where transnational threats have shattered established notions of cooperation and confrontation. There are some firm areas and principles that should anchor and guide such actions. Chiefly, there is a clear need to protect and promote human rights, as well as to bolster the institutional mechanisms that support them. A crucial step in the right direction is the US decision to run for a seat in the 47-member Human Rights Council this month. This is particularly important in view of the fact that the status and working methods of the Council will be reviewed by the General Assembly in the year 2011. As I have discussed previously, to counter genocide, mass atrocities, and human rights abuses, the international community, with active US contribution, devised an ever more sophisticated mechanisms of international justice, wherein individual criminal responsibilities could be ascertained. The International Criminal Court, ICC, was conceived with this aim in mind. The Clinton administration had signed on to the court. That decision was reversed by the Bush administration, which also sought to limit other nations' collaboration with the court. I urge President-elect Obama to again sign on the dotted line of the ICC treaty. This will send a very powerful signal that the US is prepared to help avert and punish the most heinous human rights abuses. In the same vein, the United States should fully embrace the core human rights treaties that it has yet to sign on to. As American trust in the United Nations plummeted in the past years, so did the United Nations itself begin to face serious problems of credibility as a human rights advocate, as the preeminent guarantor of world security and the engine of human welfare. No one should underestimate the shock and the security concerns that the 9/11 attacks provoked. Terrorism represents a severe threat and a profound challenge to human rights and security. In their countermeasures, however, the United States and other governments expanded executive power at the expense of the legislature and the courts. And experience shows that if checks and balances are not adequate, the margin of abuse is high. I'm pleased that President Obama is determined to resolve the untenable situation of detainees at Guantanamo Bay, ban CIA prisons, and implement the prohibition on torture. Moreover, I would welcome any initiative that might help shed light into the still opaque areas that surround capture, interrogation methods, rendition, and detention conditions of those alleged to have been involved in terrorism. All detainees are entitled to justice and due process. Those innocent individuals caught in the web of counterterrorism measures are also entitled to reparations. In conclusion, let me reiterate that signals coming from America, the indispensable nation, reverberates around the world. Sending the right ones is the responsibility of power. And today's challenges require that the world's two crucial players, the United States and the United Nations, work together to pursue with an identity of purpose, if not an identity of methods, our shared aspirations for human rights, security, and development. Thank you very much. And now it's my turn to hear from you.
Hi, thank you for your talk. So I'll preface this question with, I don't really expect you to have an answer to it or to really try and defend the status quo, but as I'm listening to your presentation, I get a sense that a lot of what this High Council does is really document a lot of problems around the world. And I see that it can do a very good job at documenting problems. But I guess the issue, or I seem to find with the presentation, is that one of the fundamental ideas of the UN, it seems to be, is that it says that, peace and security. But oftentimes, preventing human rights violations requires not being at peace and actually going to war to prevent governments from violating these rights. And it seems like, as much as the documentation aspect, it seems like the UN does have an army. And it seems like the UN is often comprised of nations where the main issue is not nations attacking other nations, but nations basically doing horrible things to their own people. And I'm curious how the United Nations, or this council, basically comes to terms with this fact, and what sort of reforms do you think the UN needs to make internally to make itself, frankly, meaningful and not simply just creating documents?
Should I take, well, let's do it one by one. The United Nations, you're asking a question that goes beyond the realm of human rights, beyond the realm of Human Rights Council, beyond the realm of the Office of High Commissioner, into the core of decision-making, of binding decision-making, which is the Security Council. The United Nations is, in the first instance, a collection of member states, governments coming together to find a common course of action on particular challenges. Sovereignty is a key principle of the United Nations. But what you see happening over the years with increasing globalization, with increased rights consciousness on the part of everyday people, and the increased pressure put upon governments to promote and respect their human rights, there's the discussion, the margins of sovereignty has started to fray, if I may put it that way. So, for example, at the 2005 World Summit, world leaders, presidents and prime ministers, got together at the UN for the summit and agreed to 3 key paragraphs on the responsibility to protect. The idea being that sovereignty is not about power to reign over people, but about responsibility towards those people. And if that responsibility to protect its own citizens is somehow lack of will, lack of capacity, or outright then the international community has to step in to exercise that responsibility. Those are the three key paragraphs. In the first instance, it's the individual governments who have to implement that responsibility. If the government doesn't have the capacity, then the international community has to step in to help nurture that capacity. And in the end, if that responsibility is not undertaken, then the international community, through the Security Council, has to step in. And then it begins from the very diplomatic means all the way down to the military means. The three paragraphs are just limited to genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing. Specifically, in only those cases is this doctrine activated. So the doctrine has been agreed to in 2005. The operationalization of that doctrine into concrete action on the ground have not yet developed. And getting from that doctrine to operation is a huge challenge for the system because many states are still very wary of any fraying of the sovereignty. And that's the reality. But the Secretary General has a moral responsibility. The High Commissioners with her human rights amendment has the moral responsibility to further elaborate and push the envelope, if you may call it that, on this key concept, which we think is a vital turning point for the international community. Because for the first time, a concept that gives specific responsibility to an international institution beyond sovereignty has been written out and documented and adopted at the World Summit level. So it's a very slow process, but I think the world has moved beyond that era where nothing could be done beyond the word sovereignty. I know that it's in terms of the concrete action, it's frustrating, but I think in the larger in the evolution of things, I think we're headed in the very right direction. Thank you.
Okay, my question first of all, involves a couple of assumptions. Most of us here probably agree that the enforcement and realization of human rights are very important. And it seems to me that if we want to promote human rights, then people have to know what human rights are. What are the assumptions of human rights? What are conflicts in human rights? How can human rights apply to their discipline? Human rights deals with philosophy, anthropology, sociology, public policy, political science, public health, law, gender and women's studies, and education. And yet I'm wondering how many of these courses have a major component that actually includes a discussion of human rights. If we want to enforce human rights, it is my view that people have to be educated about them in the United States and elsewhere. So if we want to enforce human rights, we have to do this. And I'm wondering how many people at UMBC actually incorporate human rights. Do the public policy people, do you have a course? What about the public health? There's all kinds of health and human rights information going on. What about philosophy and morality? Do you teach human rights as one of your ethical philosophies? And I can tell you that I do my best to try to use human rights as the framework for all my human sexuality classes, and my students do not know much about human rights before they come into my classroom. And I make them memorize this different conferences, and they have a hard time keeping all this information straight. So I would like to make a plea for promoting education all around the world in your job and at UMBC in promoting human rights, and that's what I want to say. How can we do that?
Thank you very much. A very pertinent point, and we do. Human rights education is also part of the High Commissioner's mandate. The resolution that created this post in 1993 specifically says the High Commissioner has the lead on educating education of human rights around the world. So it's an important part of our mandate, and we do that in close collaboration with UNESCO, UNESCO has a huge program on human rights education. Wish we could be doing enough, and we count on partners such as yourselves. And I think it's wonderful that the center here has introduced this lecture series on human rights. Small beginnings that could lead to great ends. And I think I would urge you to keep up that advocacy on behalf of the necessity of a human rights education at various levels of the education curricula. That's not so obvious in other societies. So, for example, in my own country, the Republic of Korea, human rights is something for the lawyers and something you argue in the courts and not necessarily something that should be a part of everybody's lives. Human rights, I think human rights has to be a prism through which you look at things and challenges. As I was saying, even at the global discussion level where you have the most sophisticated minds, climate change, economic social crisis, it's very difficult to draw them down to the level of the human consequences, and let's see these consequences. And the best way to do that is this rich body of norms that spells out what the human rights dimensions of climate change and migration and all of this is. But in all direction, it's a challenge. But that shouldn't prevent us from doing it. Thank you.
Good evening, Deputy High Commissioner.
Good evening. Yes.
Okay, there, I got everybody laughing. Good. Well, as you were giving your speech, I personally was paying attention to the longevity of where the UN was going and actually solving the problems that exist throughout the world, the economic crisis, pestilence, and food, and everything else. And what seems to me personally, what happens is every time a catastrophic event happens, then as an American citizen, our rights are being taken away. Started with 9/11 and then dealing with the airports and so forth. My question to you is, what is the forecast? How can we, have the hope in knowing that, the UN is looking for the best interest of the world today without taking away, our precious rights in the future?
First of all, rights, the duty bearers to promote human rights, to prevent human rights abuses, and to fulfill human rights is the responsibility of governments. The United Nations does not have that primary responsibility. We are there to help, support, provide technical expertise, training programs, education, but it is the governments that have that responsibility. So your question, how do I get my rights protected? What can the United Nations do? The question has to be directed to your government in the first instance. The longevity of the United Nations is a very good question, but I would say it has very much to do with the U.S. engagement with the United Nations. The support, the investment of resources, the investment of goodwill, and as I said, the shared sense of purpose with the United Nations, coming from the most influential and powerful country in the world, the most powerful member in the United Nations, inevitably will have a huge influence on the future course of this global institution. I think, generally speaking, and that relationship changes from one administration to the next, and that's the nature of democracies. New governments get elected, and governments change course when new governments get elected. So that's part of the reality. But in the longer term, I think it serves the interest of the United States to have a strong and healthy and effective United Nations as its partner, rather than the other way around. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great speech, by the way. You mentioned throughout your speech that there must be a symbiotic relationship between the government and people in order for human rights and ideals of human rights to be embraced. Now, conferences such as the Durban Review conferences and other conferences that the UN does have conceive these documents and these ideals to support and embrace human rights in the different states. My question is, are there any consequences that are given by the UN to these various states that do not adhere to these documents or these agreements that are being made when you do have these conferences? And also, it seems as though that the United States is more hands-off now due to the lack of mobility and the lack of solutions that are being derived by the UN. How do you think that the United States can be remotivated to get on board back with the UN, or do you think it'll take another catastrophic event like 9/11 and terrorist attack bombers for them to get serious again with it? Because, like I said, many politicians and many people who want to bring about change cultivate different agendas and say they're going to do something, but the actions differ. So how do we remotivate the United States to get back on board, to take the lead and the initial lead to embrace human rights, and what are the consequences given to these various nations when they do not adhere to these conferences that they attend and say that, yeah.
Thank you very much. Two questions, I guess, that are, what are the consequences of these conferences and the outcomes? They have no enforcement power. The United Nations does not have a police force and an army force that can go around countries to make sure that these are implemented, and if they're not, they get sanctioned. The only force of the United States, it's the moral force that comes from the membership. When a document is adopted by the full membership, in this case -10, still 182 countries, that has a moral authority. And depending upon the governments, the document the next day is thrown out like a piece of tissue. And there are governments like that. But democratically elected governments, elected by, as I said, increasingly rights-conscious people, I would think feel a certain sense of responsibility. People are looking at the governments. People have these documents in their hands to see what is being done. And there is that increasing sense of the action that is required from the electorate. So it's people like you, the everyday people who and organize into civic activist groups who have the responsibility and who have the stake to see that these outcomes are implemented. In the case of the United States, because it didn't participate in the conference, the argument can be made that no, we don't have any moral obligation. But given that the racism issue is a huge challenge, and given as I said, power is responsibility, and hopefully, although it's said out of the conference that it will look at the documents seriously, and given the huge inspiration that had come with the election of the first African American president, that the new administration will be able to embrace the global racism agenda and become an active participant. So that's on the consequences. U.S. hands-off approach. I think as I said, strong, effective United Nations is in the interest of the U.S. If the U.S. wants to continuously lead the global community along the values that it cherishes and build consensus around its leadership, the United Nations is its most effective tool. Now, it takes time to engage other member states within the UN forum, states that may not share the same values, may have different political agenda. It takes time, it takes patience. But at the end of it, there is buy-in, there is consensual support. So the longer term wisdom would have it that the United States should take the lead, more of an active lead in the United Nations and in multilateral forum in general. And I think the part of that push once again has to come from civic groups. As in all democratic governments, the U.S. government is influenced by and is sensitive to and responds to civic pressure, and more voices on behalf of U.S. activism and positive engagement with the United Nations, I think is very much needed. I think what was lacking with the Durban Review Conference was that whereas you had a huge voice against participation being played out on a daily basis in the media and among NGOs, very little was heard from pro-Durban groups, which was rather surprising given the history and given the unique context in which the issue of racism unfolds in this country, and given, as I said, that there was a huge breakthrough and an inspiration setting with the election of the new president. There was not a huge push for participation from other parts of civil society. Thank you.
Madam Commissioner, thank you for coming to UMBC. Very nice to hear your remarks. I want to focus my question on one particular region of the world, China, for the obvious reason that it is an economic juggernaut and more than a quarter of the world's population. Last week, as you no doubt know, Amnesty International released a report about lawyers being brutalized in that country, civil rights lawyers. A reminder of the ongoing problems that important country has with human rights. I wonder if you can comment, as the commissioner, from the perspective of the United Nations, but also someone from the Korean Peninsula, where you think civil rights in China are going, where you think they should be going from the UN perspective, and perhaps also a comment to us, what you think we should ask our politicians here in the United States to do in terms of pressuring China to reform their civil rights policies.
Thank you very much. Yes, China is an increasingly important player on the global scene in all aspects of the global agenda. We are in discussion with the Chinese authorities on the human rights challenges that they face. The form of that dialogue varies from the very discreet to the very public, as it does with all of our engagements. We continue to urge the Chinese authorities to ratify the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and this has been a consistent message of us for as long as I can remember. We talk to all partners when it comes to human rights. The High Commissioner's responsibility is not to governments, but to the people, in particular the people whose rights have been violated. And when that dimension kicks in, we reserve the right and the duty to be speaking to all, regardless of their official or non-official status. So I think that's our responsibility, and sometimes it's very difficult to undertake that responsibility, but we can only be effective when we are consistent and impartial in that, and we do it vis-a-vis the Chinese authorities as we do with any other government authorities. Thank you.
Hi, I was just wondering what the UN might be doing to help the women in Afghanistan.
Thank you very much. Not as much as we wish to, but a lot. I know there's this recent law that got almost passed, but was stopped at the final stage because of an outcry that would take women in Afghanistan many decades back. And the High Commissioner came up with a very strong statement condemning this piece of legislation that would have been a huge setback. So that's one role of the High Commissioner: advocacy, drawing attention to challenges, drawing attention to problems. We have people who are part of the United Nations mission in Afghanistan called UNAMA, human rights components there, who monitors human rights developments in the country, not only in the capital, but in various regions of the world, to the extent that the security situation permits us to go. We engage in training, provide workshops, we study their legislation and offer advice, criticism on things, on developments that we, from the International Human Rights Standard point of view, shouldn't be going in that direction. So we are doing as much as we can, is what I can say. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming to UMBC. I apologize in advance for putting you on the spot with the following. For one, I'm interested in learning the UN stance on the right of self-determination for North American the right of self-determination for North American natives. I am interested in learning if the Durban Review records any instances of human rights violations and discrimination against individuals of European descent by individuals not of European descent, and I would like to know if the UN has an armed military mission in a country when the majority of the population decides to start taking farm equipment to a minority, if something will be done this time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think you're talking about the issue of indigenous people's rights.
Yes.
Yes. The UN has a very important normative instrument called the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that was adopted by the General Assembly, I think, 2 years ago, and that is being embraced by an increasing numbers of governments with huge pockets of indigenous populations. That's not indigenous peoples. And one of our advocacy messages is to urge governments to sign on to this declaration. Recently, a breakthrough was the Australian government, which had voted against the adoption of this declaration in the GA, has now signed on to the declaration. So there is progress, and we continue to advocate for that. Your point about people of European descent being discriminated about non-European, did I get that right, or was it the other one?
Yes, have you recorded any instances of this?
Not that I can recall. In any particular country or situation, or you?
I am referring explicitly to the farm attacks and the displacement in Zimbabwe, but I believe there are other examples.
Yes. I think Zimbabwe, of course, is a huge human rights crisis, and we follow it very closely from our office in Pretoria. We do not have access to the country. The government simply does not give our officers visa to go in and monitor the situation and to document the abuses. But we do keep close track through our occasional visits to the extent that we are allowed to go in. And but it's a very, very frustrating situation. Thank you.
And my final question.
Can you repeat that, please?
In the event that the circumstances surrounding the 1994 Rwanda genocide with regard to a large ethnic group in a country taking farm equipment to a minority group in a country with an active military mission of the United Nations, is there any reason to believe that something will be done this time?
Well, I think, you know, hopefully the experience of '94 has been painfully learned. One of the things that came out of that tragedy was the International Criminal Court on the Rwanda genocide, and the High Commissioner herself was the president of this court and brought very important cases, and she got a former prime minister convicted. So hopefully with the international criminal justice system in place, now more permanent with the ICC, with the UN system having learned the painful lessons, hopefully it will not happen. Hopefully we will be able to catch the early signs early on so that we can contain and stabilize and address the violations before they explode out of proportions. But I would hope that hypothetically, if there was such a situation, that the international system and all the key players are much more better equipped than it was the last time. Thank you.
Hi. I recognize the most recent conference and the irony of the United States not being involved, thus having an African American president. But I saw that you said that all the groups that were involved, that you were trying to, the migrant workers and xenophobia and racism. But I was wondering if anything was going to be done regarding sexual minorities, because that is such an important thing. And the United States currently has something on the docket regarding hate crimes, and that's something that looks like it's not going to go through. And you know, what if the United Nations is going to be involved in anything like that?
The issue of sexual minorities sexual orientation is a very divisive issue in the UN setting. There are countries who are very much for the rights of sexual minorities. There are countries who even refuse to acknowledge that such a phenomena exists. And given that big divide, consensual language cannot be expected. And therefore, there was a paragraph referring to sexual minorities in the initial draft, but in the end, it was not kept in the final document because there was not consensus. But from the High Commissioner's office, we very much support and speak out against the persecution of sexual minorities.
I guess a country that's been largely absent from or a region that's been largely absent from this discussion is Latin America. And I know that although we have a moral obligation to uphold human rights, in the former part of your discussion, you talked a lot about how countries on both sides of the spectrum economically, whether they're command economies or are trying to uphold their free market rights, may be opposed to certain human rights doctrines for their, I guess, financial feasibility. How do you see this? What is the role of the international community in upholding rights of workers in countries that have been exploited by private entities, whether they're corporations or countries who are supporting policies economically that are exploiting workers, and something that's not as, I guess, much in the mainstream? What is the role of the international community or an entity such as the United Nations in this issue?
Yeah. Well, as you may know, there is a huge international entity that is tasked specifically to protect the rights of workers in the International Labor Organization. So that ILO has the lead on workers' rights issues. But of course, from a human rights perspective, we also have a huge interest in looking at the situation of workers wherever their rights may be violated. I think in this regard, an encouraging development is that the rights consciousness on the part of corporate entities is also growing. The Secretary General, the previous Secretary General, had what is called a global compact, where it was voluntary membership, but global multinational corporations could sign on to, and the deal was you give a status as a member of this alliance to the extent that you protect the rights of your workers, you go into other countries and you protect the local customs and so on and so forth. And that this has seen a growing membership over the years. And what you are also seeing with these corporations is that corporate entities who have signed on to this compact with sincerity, with genuine intent, they go into countries, they invest in countries, and they find partners who share that value. And when it turns out the local entity does not, then we've seen this in Guatemala. Guatemala, where indigenous people's rights and land rights is huge, there was a concrete case where an international investor in the end decided not to invest because the local partner was very insensitive to local people's rights, local workers' rights, and so on and so forth. So I think corporations, the corporate responsibility, if not in fulfilling rights, at least in upholding and respecting rights, is something that is growing. There is a special mechanism that reports to the Human Rights Council on the human rights responsibility of transnational corporations. An independent expert has this task and visits countries to see how this responsibility is being upheld. So progress is slow, but there is progress in the right direction. Thank you.
World War II, we had a new economic standard that's been set in place. The United States being the leader, I guess, in the, correct me if I'm wrong, the FI GDP.
Can you
A little more clarify.
fully? Yes.
The United States is the leading in finances, financial. Basically, they control the world's, like the stock market. So, okay.
Excuse me, I think you may be referring to the Bretton Woods II economic system?
Yes, thank you, that.
The IMF and the World Bank?
Yes,
Yeah? Okay.
the World Bank, yes. Okay, since the United States, since the stock market has recently plummeted, and I saw news updates where the Vatican declared themselves as independent and seeking to take control of that. I want to know how does the UN view this for future gain as far as helping establish a more secure financial establishment? I believe you get what I'm trying to say.
Yes, but I'm not sure I have an answer. Yes, I think huge players in the global institutional setup have been meeting in various formulations, the G20 or 21, and trying to come up with a structure that better addresses the financial crisis. I understand that the IMF has been given a boost with more money that it can then loan out to countries in need. World Bank, not so. But and this is not just now, we're constantly trying to engage these financial institutions so as to integrate human rights concerns into their programmatic activities, so that if the World Bank goes and builds roads for a particular country, we try to make sure that the rights of people affected by these infrastructure projects are appropriately addressed. They may not be fully guaranteed, but at least there has to be a discussion on the rights implications of these big projects. And increasingly, our partners are more willing to engage with us on these kinds of dialogues. That's as much as I can say. I don't think beyond that, I don't think the High Commissioner has the magic wand to say to the money institutions to think this way or that way.
Yes, I understand. The reason why I asked the question is because in sort of a way it pertains to human rights.
Yes, very much so. The economic crisis has huge human rights implications. You see that when crisis strikes, it is the most vulnerable segments of societies who are the first to get hit, who are the most affected negatively, because they don't have the means to protect themselves, to shield themselves from populations. So we constantly make the argument that the most vulnerable has to be given focused attention in any kind of measures to adapt to or mitigate or prevent future crises. And the same with climate change. Climate change affects, for example, in African community, the climate change, less water resources. The first to be hit are by women who have the daily task of walking kilometers for a bowl full of drinking water. And as water resources shrink, the hardship falls on these women in the first instance. So the constant attempt to bring the focus to bear upon the human faces, the human consequences of these crises, in the language of rights, not in terms of humanitarian assistance. The humanitarian assistance is very much needed, and when crisis breaks, people don't have food or water. You have to go there with material to give them shelter, food, and clothing. But along with that, there has to be a human rights impulse. The humanitarian impulse is sympathy. When you see suffering, you want to give. The human rights impulse is injustice, to see that the dignity of people have been shattered. And that sense of injustice, I think, prompts action. And the two of them have to go together.
Yes, yes.
Thank you.
I think that we have really taken enough of her time. We do have a reception afterwards, and if you have questions, you can continue if she still has any voice left. But please join me in thanking